Hey, super awesome listeners. This week in this feed for What Are You Listening To, we've got episode 2 of season 2 of The Battle, this time focusing on true crime and criminals and the songs they inspired. So, this is episode 2, and if you like it, tell your friends, share, subscribe, and leave us a great review. We're getting a lot of great response on this, so happy to share it with Jenn's listeners today. Welcome to The Battle, Season 2. This is Matt Sidhom alongside Jenn, Tully, and this season we are delving into the world of true crime. 16 songs inspired by true crimes and or criminals, and we're going to go through each one. Every week you will learn something new about the crimes or criminals as they advance through, and don't worry, for those that are eliminated, we will find a way to get you the rest of those stories. This week, we are back in the serial killer division. It is Leeds United by Luke Haines taking on Suffer Little Children by the Smiths. So, Jenn, let's start with the Smiths. I mean, I'll be honest, it didn't surprise me. This can't be their only song about serial killers, right? They must have other songs.
Right. Right. I mean, it's tough to tell, right? Like when you're listening to a Smith song, you're going to like cry in your room, right? You're not listening to the Smiths to like hear all of my most closest friends from high school and beyond. My emo friends are going to hate me for this episode. Yeah, but definitely this, I will say, like, yes, Morrissey is not known for his upbeat music, nor the Smiths. But this one is this was an early song for them. This was one of the first songs that Morrissey and Johnny Marr wrote together. Morrissey wrote the lyrics and Johnny Marr wrote the music. And it's not surprising to me that this is what they settled on for, a first song to write together. Seems fitting. But this song is inspired by what's known as the Moors murders. And from what I could gather, I mean, this is a pretty infamous British crime. We talked about some American crimes on episode 1. This is sort of our British division of that. And in Manchester, this was a big deal. This was almost like the Manson family killings, right? This was something that was like a true life boogeyman story for people that were growing up in the Manchester area around this time, which Morrissey was. He was a little bit younger than some of the victims, but these cuckoo crazies here with the Moors murders, it was a boyfriend-girlfriend pair. And that were kind of, Bonnie and Clyde-ish in their devotion to one another. And they were a particular brand of nasty in that they murdered children. They tortured them. They sexually assaulted them. They murdered them and then buried them in very shallow graves on the moors overlooking Manchester. So this is just a chilling story all the way around. And as much as, we sort of poke fun of Morrissey and the Smiths in the beginning, I think the story is handled really well in their hands. The tone is right. The lyrics are brutal and haunting, like the crimes were. They're vague. Like the crimes were at the time. And again, this pair, their names were Myra Hendley and Ian Brady, were these two psychos. And they began their murdering spree in 1963. And I think that, again, Morrissey was, I believe he was around 4 or 5 in 1963. I believe he was born in 1959. So again, this is one of those stories that became kind of a cautionary tale, a boogeyman, a get home before dark kind of thing that parents would legitimately warn their children about because this was something actively happening. So again, when I think last week we talked about a historic event, with the Troubles, and this is something that was playing out in real time for Morrissey. This is something that he grew up with and decided to eventually write about.
Yeah, I mean, listening to the song and you did the research on this one, but me just hearing it, there's so many details in there, right? Like very specifics that I'm like, you don't get the reference necessarily if you don't know the context behind it. it certainly sounds sad, right? And even, some of the lyrics, I know my son is dead. I'll never have my hands on his sacred head. Like anybody who has children, I mean, just these lyrics by themselves, not knowing the story, it just sounds awful. Like something awful has happened when you're
Yes.
listening to this song. But then, yeah, just hearing that story whenever, I mean, not that hearing about the murder of anyone is ever a good thing, right? But when you hear about children, it's just like, oh, that's just gutting.
Well, and the song caused a lot of outrage for that very reason. I mean, I think the Smiths and Morrissey in particular are no strangers to stirring up controversy. And this, not new for them now, but back then, this was kind of one of the first things that did it. There were a lot of people that were outraged that they would have, the gumption to tell this story in a song. And, Morrissey said that he was always really bummed that nobody asked him. Nobody said to him, like, why did you write this? Or what does this mean to you? Or what is this about? There was just a lot of conjecture around, like, oh, Morrissey this, Morrissey that. And really for him, this was a crime that was wicked beyond belief, and he lived with it. He lived in the area where I believe one of the victims was taken on a street that he walked home from every day. So this was a very real thing. And he said it always bothered him that people thought he was sort of exploiting it or, using this to stir up controversy. That was never what it was about for him. And so this is a song that I believe in researching, I think they've only played it live maybe twice in the very, very beginning. And then it was so polarizing and stirred up so much controversy that they just kind of shelved it. They don't play it live. It's not something that you find in their, repertoire when they're on tour. This is something that they've kind of like dialed back and keep just in the annals of the Smiths' history.
That's so interesting that, that just no one would be curious enough to ask the question, right? And to delve a little deeper and just sort of chalk it up to, I don't know, just something controversial. But from a subject matter standpoint, I guess I kind of understand it. Maybe it's just easier to just dismiss out of hand. But yeah, that is interesting. Why no one would just sort of dive in and wonder what this was all about? Because yeah, like we said, like, okay, the Smiths write a lot of sad songs. Why would you go to this topic, right? I think that would, I don't know, if I were a music journalist, I feel like I would kind of fixate on this and wonder why, the death of children would somehow trigger something in Morrissey. So that's really interesting that nobody ever kind of took a deeper look into that.
I did find an article, he was talking to Morrissey, he being Morrissey, was talking to Spin Magazine in 1986. And, as I mentioned, he was really upset that nobody talked to him and that a lot of assumptions were made by why he wrote it. And so I did find this quote that I thought was interesting. He said, "Veiling the Moors' murders is wrong. We must bring it to the fore. If we don't overstate things, they'll continue to happen. We don't forget the atrocities of Hitler, do we? In the North, I was painted as a hideous satanic monster, and the word was that I had upset Ann West, who was one of the victims' mothers. In fact, I had not, and have since become great friends with her. She is a formidable figure." So he really made a point to talk about how not only was this something that affected him deeply because the victims were from the area where he grew up, but also he went and tried to make amends with the victims' parents and families, and to see if there was anything that he could do to comfort them in writing this song or knowing this song was out there and sort of bringing up old wounds. And so he did spend a lot of time. It looked like, from what I could gather and research, that he did really try and do right by the victims' families.
Which is really interesting for a guy who kind of has a reputation for just being
Not giving it.
intolerable to deal with. Yeah, like don't care about anybody. I'm going to be difficult. I'm going to be this. And yet, obviously, these murders struck a nerve with him, right?
Yeah.
And this time really stayed with him. And then to the extent that he would reach out to these families and make sure he was good with them. He doesn't seem to care anything about the rest of the world, but made a point to connect with them on this particular subject. So I actually, I mean, that makes me for me, having just heard all the bad things and all the difficult things about Morrissey, that actually really kind of elevates him in my mind.
Same. I thought the same thing because that was the first thing, he has a reputation of being such a shock jock about things that you immediately go to that place. And so and it made me wonder, since this was one of their early songs, if that's, they tell you like, don't ever tell a kid like they're bad, because they're going to, like, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So I wonder if like early
Mm-hmm.
on this controversy was stirred up and sort of pinned on him as being like somebody who likes to exploit things. And so he just sort of, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I was thinking about that a lot as I was going down, because I really did, in everything that I read about this, it seemed that his intentions really were true in wanting to shed light on this story and bring some relief to the families that had suffered during this time,
Mm-hmm.
which is out of character for a guy that you only hear controversy, controversy, controversy about.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. Now on the other side, okay, obviously the Smiths tend to, write a lot of songs that, maybe are inherently a little sad. We get a song
Moody.
that is kind of a moody. Let's call it moody. Yes. But on my side, I had a song that was surprisingly upbeat. Okay, so it's "Leeds United" by Luke Haines. Were you familiar with this song at all?
Not at all. I was not familiar with this artist. I was not familiar with this song. And I still am incredibly curious to know what in the world it's about, because it sounds like it's about sports. When I listen to this song,
Yeah.
I'm like, this sounds like it's about a football game. What do we do? And I mean, like,
Yes.
football. Not like
Footy. Yes,
footy.
Leeds United is a football club, right? And so you listen to this, and it sounds like just an anthem for the football club,
It
right?
does.
But in fact, it's peppered with references to the Yorkshire Ripper,
Oh.
whose real name was Peter Sutcliffe.
Oh, I'm guessing that's
And
not the striker for the team. That's not
well,
mid center fielder.
he was a striker, but in a very different sort of way, Jen. So Luke Haines was born in 1967. So technically, he was alive when this was going on. He did not write this song, or at least not release it, until 2007. So
Oh.
much later in his career as a singer-songwriter. But this began kind of technically in 1969, although it wasn't until 1975 when Sutcliffe actually murdered his first victim. So I will elaborate on that. So, not surprisingly, we've talked about this already. Peter Sutcliffe, he came from an abusive home. Okay, terribly abusive father, and abusive towards the children as well as Sutcliffe's mother. Now, this drove Sutcliffe's mother to cheat on her father, and his father decided to expose this to the entire family. Okay, because by all accounts, he's a terrible human being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But what that triggered in Sutcliffe, not only did he get this violence from his father, but now he gets this incredible mistrust of women and this almost hatred of women. And so all of his victims henceforth would be women, and in particular prostitutes, okay, because he really never had a steady, I mean, I think he was married, but a couple times, but it was always these, he would go off with prostitutes quite often, and just never could have a real stable relationship. Now, he would attack his victims with one of two items, either a sock with a stone in it or a hammer.
Hmm.
And after knocking them out, he would stab them repeatedly.
Okie dokie.
His first assault was in 1969. That woman survived.
Oof.
No charges were pressed.
What?
And then as we
Wow.
move into the 70s, he would continue to attack women. He did not actually kill a woman until 1975. He would just have these brutal attacks on them. In fact, there were three prior to his first official victim in 1975. Actually, they're all victims, but the one who actually died, there were three prior to that in the same year in 1975 that he would strike with either a hammer or the sock with a stone in it. He would stab them 3 of them survived these attacks because he was interrupted in some way, shape, or form and just fled the scene. 2 of them suffered brain injuries to where they couldn't necessarily, like, the police did not deem them reliable narrators.
Mm.
The other one did try to give an eyewitness account, but of course back then there's no DNA evidence. And we're talking about the early 70s, right?
Right.
Early to mid 70s. There's no DNA evidence. There's nothing you're going to tie to anybody, nothing like that. And so, yeah, over the years, he ends up killing 13 women, but there were actually a number of other women he would attack and, injure, but not actually kill. And so, really disturbing, not just the fact that he committed these crimes, right? But also the fact that there were a number of women who came forth and spoke to the Yorkshire police about, hey, this is what happened to me. And they just were kind of dismissed. Like, it wasn't something that they were never able to really run this down. I mean, he was interviewed a number of times over the course of this investigation, and they couldn't, they still couldn't pin him down. So it's something where it was really just kind of sad, obviously, not just hearing about the murders and the attacks over the years, but more so like the ones who survived trying to kind of get this man convicted, and yet it could never come to pass.
Well, and I think too, again, in thinking about like reason for writing songs like this or hosting a show like this or talking about things like this, I think again, it offers that perspective. Like, I think it's sometimes hard for people to understand, well, if something terrible happened to this woman, why wouldn't she come forward? You hear a lot of like men saying that, well, then she's lying or she would have come forward if this was real. Well, think about what it feels like to come forward, to expose a terrible thing, to relive it in retelling it, and then be completely dismissed or not believed. Like, there's a long history of that in our country and abroad, that I think keeps women silent. And so I think the more we surface stories about this and we talk about things like this, again, it brings it to light, and hopefully things don't get repeated. We say like, oh my gosh, what a terrible mistake that was from 50 years ago. Like, we can't let that happen in this day and age. Like, we have to make sure that we're digging deeper, and we have a ton of technology. Back then there wasn't a database. Like you said, there wasn't DNA. Like, you couldn't just run this guy's fingerprints and see if he had priors, like they didn't, the policing wasn't that sophisticated, and certainly detective work was not either. So it was a different time, but I think it's interesting to note that 50 years ago these women were coming forward, and because they were seen as more vulnerable or less than upstanding citizens in the community, perhaps they were sort of dismissed. They were treated as like disposable almost in some instances. And you hear that a lot with some of these serial killer cases. They were very smart in who they targeted, because they knew that these oftentimes women would not be given a second thought, really. They were kind of disposable members of society. So I think that it's interesting that Luke Haines chose to sing about this. And then I think it's interesting that he wrapped it up in this song that sounds like it's a football anthem. Did you find anything
Yes.
out about that? Like, why he chose to make it sound like this?
I didn't. I couldn't find anything on that exactly, except that most people do mistake it for some sort of anthem, for the
Yeah.
team. And he even makes references in there. But, it's interesting because he references a 13-0 defeat. Well, that 13 is the number of victims that were
Yeah.
taken here, right? And the loss is because obviously we lost lives, but also just the fact that it's like, you could have stopped this person, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the, when you read up on this, that's the thing that will come up over and over again, is like, wait, why couldn't they stop this person? Because he wasn't in a really broad area. It sounded like all of it took place within a fairly small area, a lot of his crimes, and yet it took a long time before they were able to actually track down who the killer was.
Wow. And was he, I don't know if there was any, well, this may be for a later episode, if this should advance or could be in our bonus material, but was he copycatting Jack the Ripper, or was that just the name that they kind of gave him because he was stabbing people?
So it was interesting. There was actually a tape sent, like a cassette tape sent to the police that made reference to the name Jack, right? And
Mm.
it came to be proven a hoax, that recording. But when that recording became publicized as, because it was almost this taunting recording, right? It was like, you still haven't caught me. You're nowhere closer than you were 4 years ago, right? And the media dubbed it the Yorkshire Ripper. And so that was the
Mm.
tie-in there. That's where the name came from, but it was not something where he declared he was inspired in some way by it. It was, and I haven't done a deep dive into Jack the Ripper, but potentially, similar origins of this awful childhood and somehow this hatred of women that led to all these awful crimes.
Yep. I'm seeing a
So Jenn,
thread. I'm
let's
seeing a
talk.
common thread.
Yes, a very depressing common thread through
Yeah.
that we'll see throughout these true crime songs and these stories. So Jenn, just based on, let's talk about the songs themselves. Two very different sounding songs. So just based on the songs alone, and then we'll get to the stories. Which one would you favor here?
Wow, this is so tricky, and I've been thinking about it ever since we like put these songs against one another. Like, how am I going to pick a winner here? I feel like I really respect what the Smiths did with Suffer Little Children. I feel like it's a deep song. It's a song that once you know what it's about, makes perfect sense. And it's a classic Smith song. Like it sounds, if you like the Smiths, if you like Morrissey, like this song's going to deliver for you. What I find interesting about about Leeds United and the Luke Haines song is that it completely turned me around, right? It was something, like I said, I thought it was about football. I thought it was about sports. And so to hear that there's a deeper meaning there and there's something else going on, I actually kind of like that. Like I like the surprise factor. So again, I think you're just like racking up the wins here, Matt, but I feel like because it was surprising to me, and it turned me around. It shocked me. I was surprised that to learn what Leeds United was about. That I think I kind of, from a song standpoint, I think I have to go with the Luke Haines song for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I kind of went the other way. I kind of went with the Smiths. I went the opposite way, just because the Luke Haines song, I don't know. I mean, there might be plenty of people who listen to it, and thankfully the football club hasn't adopted it, or else there'd probably be an awkward moment at some point. But there's probably plenty of people who listen to it and never even think twice about what it might be about.
Right.
And so that's where I kind of almost favor the Smith song, because it's a little bit more, you're a little bit more dialed in to, like I said, I'm listening to it going, oh my God, something awful has happened. Like, what is this story behind this? And so from a song sounding standpoint, I actually kind of I went with the Smiths, because Leeds United is so far afield from what its actual subject matter is.
Yes, no, that makes sense. And I think I flip flop with you too. Like if we're talking about the story, I
Yes,
go
yes.
I
Now let's
go to
go to the next step. Yeah, the story of it and the inspiration by it.
so for the
What are
story,
your thoughts there?
I prefer Suffer Little Children. As brutal as this crime is, and honestly, as hard as it was to research, I really do. I had a new appreciation for Morrissey, learning about how this song came into life, really from him, and Johnny Marr, of course, with the music, but lyrically, it's a Morrissey song. And so I think that, yeah, I think from like a storytelling standpoint and the story behind the music and why he felt it important to share this story, I would go to Suffer Little Children, which I think would ultimately make me choose that song in a battle. So I think I would pick, if we're like all around. We're taking it home. I think I would pick Suffer Little Children in this division. But again, musically, I did like that. Um, that the Luke Haines song surprised me. I did not know what it was about, but then you almost feel kind of duped, right? Like as much as I liked being surprised, I felt a little bad about like Leeds United, Leeds United, like singing this. Right. I'm like, oh wait, like I don't want to be glorifying any of this.
Yeah, that one, I don't know. There's something just weird about the dissonance there. Whereas I'm kind of with you. I think from a story standpoint, it being so personal to Morrissey, and like I said, for me, just knowing Morrissey as this super difficult person who just doesn't care, and then to hear this, you talk about being surprised. I was like surprised in a really good way that it's like, well, good for you, kind of sharing this very personal story and sharing this song and connecting with the victims' families and all the other things. I think I would advance that one, and honestly, just a more gruesome murder that I think we probably should shed more light on and tell the story of. Not to pick one crime over another, but I am glad to read about the Yorkshire murders, and there's more to that story that we're definitely going to put some bonus content together on to share. But yeah, I think in this battle, I'm going to take the Smiths.
Me too. We're unanimous.
All right. So there you have it. Another winner in our true crime song battle. And so we will be back next week with another matchup, and stay with us all season long, not just to hear more about each of these crimes and criminals, but also for bonus content to hear more about the crimes and criminals that don't advance through the bracket. So for Jenn, this is Matt, and we'll see you next time.